Israeli forces are fighting pitched battles in Lebanon and in Gaza. The United States keeps leaking that Israel is imminently about to attack in Iran. And the Democrats are accusing Prime Minister Netanyahu of only fighting the war in order to diminish Kamala Harris's chances of getting elected. I'll have information on all of these stories and more coming up on In Focus. I don't know who's going to win the U.S. presidential elections in a month minus a couple of days, whether it's going to be Donald Trump or Kamala Harris. I don't know how to read the polls, frankly, because they tell you different things depending on whose interpretation you're listening to. But I do know that according to a poll that JNS did last week with Direct Polls polling agency, 65% of Israelis want Donald Trump to win, and only 13% of Israelis want Kamala Harris to win. The rest think that both of them might be bad for Israel or they don't have an opinion on the matter. That's pretty serious, 65 to 13. Okay, that's how Israelis feel. And why is it that Israelis feel that way? Well, let's think about it for a second. Because last week, or actually it was 2 weeks ago, and I talked about this a couple of shows ago, but the Times of Israel told us what the Biden administration intends to do to Israel on November 6th. Beginning on November 6th, they intend to start massively expanding the sanctions that they've launched against Israel since February 1st so far. They have 13 Israelis under sanctions. They just sanctioned a non-existent organization called the Hilltop Youth. And the purpose of that sanction is to essentially give them the arbitrary power to say anybody that they claim is aligned to this non-existent organization, Hilltop Youth, is also under U.S. sanctions. So it's just a blanket way, totally political, nothing factual about anything, to sanction any Israeli that they want to. And I'm sure that they will, starting on November 6th. The Times of Israel article said that they're going to start sanctioning cabinet ministers. They're going to sanction entire organizations whose only fault is that they legally build for homes for Jews in areas that Jews have the legal right to build homes in Judea and Samaria. And for that, they're going to be placed under U.S. sanctions and basically have their lives wrecked because they can't bank anymore. They can't carry out any financial operation whatsoever until and unless the executive order that Joe Biden issued on February 1st is canceled. The United States is also likely to go against Israel at the UN Security Council if Donald Trump is elected, because it's Times of Israel explained, well, if Kamala Harris is elected, they can do more with executive orders so that because she'll continue to uphold them when she comes into office. But since Donald Trump is expected to abrogate Biden's anti-Israel executive orders, the only way that they can maintain over the long haul their anti-Israel policies after Biden leaves office is by working through the UN Security Council. So that's also expected to take place beginning on November 6th. So that means that Israelis who are looking at the situation understand that our national interest is better served by Donald Trump than it is by Kamala Harris. And so that explains the polls. But what explains the Democratic allegation that Benjamin Netanyahu is plotting now, is maintaining this war only for the purpose of undermining Kamala Harris's chances of getting elected? So first of all, we have to realize that this is both insane and also racist. Why is it racist? Well, why is it insane? Because it's taking a claim that's conspiratorial for which you actually have no proof, and you're preferring it to obvious reasons for Israel, for Netanyahu to be pursuing the war. And to go through a couple of these, let's just look at what Israeli forces have found in Lebanon. Not only since the ground invasion began, but also during a series of special forces operations in South Lebanon going back several months. These were caches of arms that were exposed by the IDF spokesman, Daniel Hagari, in a briefing last week. So let's just look at a couple of these caches of weapons that Israel found. So when you look at these videos, what is it that you're seeing? You're seeing extremely sophisticated weapons. You're seeing anti-tank missiles, rockets. You're seeing an enormous amount of explosive charges. You're seeing just an insane amount of ammunition, and you're talking about the kind of rockets and missiles that make Israeli soldiers and veterans of Israel's wars who worked with missiles, who worked with rockets, who worked with this kind of ordnance, terrified. They say this kind of ordnance can destroy entire communities. And that's what they had stored. And where were they storing it? In subterranean tunnels, attack tunnels that were located just a couple hundred meters from the border, not just from the border, but from specific border communities that these various Hezbollah units were charged with targeting, with massacring, with overrunning, with conquering, and massacring the residents of. So we're talking about an October 7th-like attack that was supposed to be carried out by Hezbollah, except instead of taking over kibbutzim like Kfar Aza and Be'eri and killing tens of residents in these small communities, we're talking about them taking over entire cities like Kiryat Shmona, Nahariya, even Haifa, because once you go over parts of the Galilee, you have an open road to Haifa that have tens of thousands, indeed hundreds of thousands cumulatively of residents. So we're talking about a massive genocide that Hezbollah was planning to carry out. And these are among many, these are a small portion of the weapons that Israel has already exposed, and many, many more that Israel has yet to expose, has yet to take control over in South Lebanon. So when you look at this kind of threat that's just, a couple hundred meters from the border, you have to be insane to come away with the conclusion that the only reason that Israel has sent ground forces into South Lebanon is in order to undermine Kamala Harris's chances of getting elected. Because what you're saying is that Israel has no military motive. There's no real reason. There's no real military imperative here of protecting northern Israel, of restoring Israeli sovereign control over northern Israel from Hezbollah, which effectively has deterred Israel from asserting its sovereignty over northern Israel, especially the areas that Israel evacuated on October 8th. But in general, for years, because Israel knew that it had accumulated a very large missile and rocket and drone arsenal that was all pointed at Israel, and Israel knew that starting in 2018, Hezbollah had a plan to conquer the Galilee, and that it had the forces, the Radwan brigades, which are comprised of veterans of the terror wars of Iran, in Iraq and in Afghanistan and in Syria, and they're charged with overrunning Israeli communities. But according to The Hill, this is all nothing. This isn't why Israel is operating in Lebanon at all. Israel is only operating in Lebanon, according to, let me just see, who is it? Senator Chris Murray, Democrat of Connecticut. He said, "I certainly worry that Prime Minister Netanyahu is watching the American elections as he makes decisions about his military campaigns in the north and in Gaza. I hope this is not true, but it's certainly a possibility that Israeli government is not going to sign any diplomatic agreement prior to the American election as a means potentially to try to influence the result." Okay, so this is a conspiracy theory, and it is also racist. It is an anti-Semitic allegation against Israel, because all Chris Murphy has to do, Democrat Connecticut, has to do in order to understand why Israel is fighting in Lebanon is look at the threat that Hezbollah poses to Israel. Now, it's true that Israel has decapitated Hezbollah's leadership, and that Israel, through a series of extraordinary operations, intelligence operations, was able to take out a large swath of Hezbollah's operational leadership, its tactical leaders, and its more strategic level leaders from Nasrallah and Nasrallah's replacement on down, with the beepers and the walkie-talkies, and then with the bombing of Nasrallah's bunker and the bombing of Nasrallah's replacement's bunker, etc. That's true. But they still have commanders, and they still have forces. I mean, what happens in an army when a commander is killed? In Israel, we had 3 brigade commanders who were killed on October 7th. What happened to their brigades? Well, they got new commanders. Yes, it takes a little bit of time, but you have 40,000 forces, 20,000 regular forces, 20,000 reservists in the Radwan brigades that are all located adjacent the Lebanese border with Israel, and they know what their orders are. They've been training for the mission of conquering the Galilee for years, since 2018 at least. That's 6 years ago, when Hezbollah's plan to take over the Galilee, when Hezbollah first published its plan, so that we could all know that this is what they were doing, right? So Israel has a threat. It's facing an extraordinary threat from Lebanon, and yet here comes Chris Murphy, and he's saying, no, Israel's only attacking Lebanon for electoral considerations in the United States. That's all, that we don't want a ceasefire because of electoral considerations. But again, no. In order to reach that conclusion, you have to ignore entirely everything that we know about the war in Lebanon, everything that we know about what Hezbollah was planning, everything that we know about what Hezbollah had, what they were preparing for, what they were training for, what they are training for, what they continue to be committed to carrying out, which is the annihilation of Israel, which is the massacre of the people of Israel. But this is pure bigotry to say this. This is to tell the American people, to tell Connecticut voters, to tell voters throughout the United States that what you really need to do is ignore everything that we see about the war, everything that we know about Hezbollah, about Iran that just shot 200 ballistic missiles at Israel in a single evening last week, right? Me and my family, we were all sitting in this room that I tape in from home. I'm in my home studio today. We were sitting here for over, 2 hours or something like that from the time that we got the emergency order from the Home Front Command to go immediately into our shelters. We were sitting here with our dogs, right, waiting for the all clear. And while we were sitting here, we heard boom after boom after boom after boom of missiles or missile interceptors falling all around us in our communities. There were a few boys in one of my son's classes who were stuck. They were stuck outside, and so they were actually taking pictures of what they saw in the sky. And you saw a lot of missiles being intercepted in the area that we live in. And this is not only the case where we live, it's all over Israel. This was a massive ballistic missile assault on Israel. And Israel apparently intercepted about 85% of the missiles, but 15% or so got in. They caused some damage, not massive, but some damage to Nevatim Air Base. They damaged 100 apartments in Hoda Sharon. So this is a big deal, right? But Israel is also supposed to stand down, because if we don't, we're going to undermine. We're going to be accused. In fact, we're accused anyway of interfering with the American presidential elections. But we're in the middle of a war. It's our fault that it's the American presidential elections now. What do we have to do with any of that? Nothing. We didn't determine when the U.S. elections were going to be, and we also didn't decide that Hamas was going to invade us on October 7, 2023, and we were going to be finding ourselves in a war for our national survival. But the Democrats are very quick to put out this story. The Hill is very quick to enthusiastically report this story, right? Which is just an anti-Semitic conspiracy, which is just saying that this is what the Jews do, that we're waging this entire war in Lebanon and Gaza. We refuse a ceasefire only because we want to impact the U.S. presidential elections. What we really know from stories that the administration itself has put out over the past several weeks, including the story that I just cited from the Times of Israel, that the United States essentially has a stopwatch. The Biden-Harris administration is holding a stopwatch to Israel's head. They're saying to us, tick tock, come November 6th, when we're no longer restrained by the need to pay lip service to supporting Israel, we're going to come after you. We're going to come after you with sanctions, and then they're already telegraphing what they're doing. So I mentioned in the opening that Emmanuel Macron announced over the weekend that he's going to place an arms embargo on Israel. And, by the way, just for the fun of us, let's just watch what Prime Minister Netanyahu had to say to Emmanuel Macron in response to his statement.
Today, Israel is defending itself on 7 fronts against the enemies of civilization. As Israel fights the forces of barbarism led by Iran, all civilized countries should be standing firmly by Israel's side. Yet President Macron and some other Western leaders are now calling for an arms embargo against Israel. Shame on them. Is Iran imposing an arms embargo on Hezbollah, on the Houthis, on Hamas, And on its other proxies? Of course not. The axis of terror stands together. But countries who supposedly oppose this terror axis call for an arms embargo on Israel. What a disgrace. Well, let me tell you this. Israel will win with or without their support. But their shame will continue long after the war is won.
So in addition to what Netanyahu said, which was just like, that was like a boss statement, saying that's a boss move, as I always say, that was a serious statement saying, yeah, right, we're going to win with you or without you. Without you, you're just going to be in shame, which is true. But, people say that Lebanon used to be the Paris of the Middle East. And now we know that Paris is more like the Beirut of Europe today. I mean, if you go to Paris, that's what you see. That's what you're feeling. You feel like you're in Beirut more than you feel like you're in Paris of yesteryear, when they used to call Beirut the Paris of the Middle East, right? So you had this transformation, and we saw it also over the weekend. I think it was over Saturday night. Israel attacked what was essentially supposed to be a Total Energy French-owned installation or gas station. I'm not quite sure. And look what happens. We bomb this French installation. Now look at what happens when it blows up. That's right. Those are secondary and tertiary bombs. That means that there are arms, caches, located underneath this French installation. Do you think the French didn't know that? Do you think that the French really don't know the nature of Lebanon that they so wish to uphold and protect? Of course they know. They've been playing this game for decades, right? France essentially worked as the Lebanese foreign ministry during the Second Lebanon War, which was really the first, people like to say this is the first Israel-Iran war, but actually in 2006, when Hezbollah opened fire on Israel in July of 2006 and captured, killed, and took hostage the bodies of two Israeli soldiers, reserve soldiers, and murdered another 8, I think, in their patrol along the border inside of Israel, right? And they started the war with this massive missile assault on Israel at the same time. That was the first Iranian-Israel war, or if you will, the first Hezbollah-Israel war, and Hezbollah is controlled by Iran, and therefore it was the first Iranian war against Israel through Hezbollah in South Lebanon. And France acted effectively as Lebanon's foreign minister. Condoleezza Rice was in charge of getting Israel to heal, and with our not at all intelligent and not at all talented foreign minister at the time, Tzipi Livni, going along for the ride as her lapdog, and then the French acting essentially as Hezbollah's emissaries. They put together Resolution 1701, which, by the way, makes no mention of Hezbollah, right? And that was the end of the war. It was a very, very bad resolution for Israel. It could have been much worse, but it was a bad one because it pretended that there was some sort of international condominium of interest that were going to push Hezbollah forces away from the border. And in the event, they never did, because the only force capable of actually taking care of Hezbollah is a force that has a national interest, a vested interest in doing so. And the only force that has a vested interest in fighting Hezbollah, at least along the border with Lebanon, with northern Israel, is the Israel Defense Forces. So in the absence of an Israeli operation to push Hezbollah physically away from the border by annihilating its forces or by just physically removing them from the area and forcing them to go north, nobody's going to do it, and nobody did. But it was France that negotiated on behalf of Hezbollah, on behalf of Lebanon. So they've been at this game for years, and so first, Emmanuel Macron announces that they're going to embargo Israel, but in fact, Israel hasn't really received anything from France in terms of military supply since the 1960s. And second, we know, and he said it's because of the situation in Gaza. Oh, poppycock. It's because you're afraid of what we're going to discover about France's involvement with Hezbollah in Lebanon. And lo and behold, hours later, the IDF carries out this assault that is located of a Hezbollah arms cache that's located where? Underneath a Total Energy French-owned gas station or gas installation. I still haven't figured that one out yet, but a French equity, to use Obama's favorite word, inside of Beirut, right? That's what happened. So at least we know that in this instance, France had knowledge that their installation was used as a place to put arms by Hezbollah. All right, so that's that. But and then what happens after that? Tony Blinken puts out this statement. Look at that, praising France, praising Emmanuel Macron hours after Emmanuel Macron announced an arms embargo on Israel. So he then comes in and he praises him. He also praised Qatar because why not? The fact that they're the second largest state sponsor of terrorism after Iran is neither here nor there. They're fantastic because. And then on the other hand, this is what, and then Kamala Harris puts out this note on Twitter. What does she say? She's giving $137 million in U.S. taxpayer money to Lebanon. Why? Because it's a humanitarian disaster. What about the humanitarian disaster, for instance, in North Carolina? Well, FEMA doesn't have enough money because they used, $100 million or whatever it was to set up housing for illegal aliens. So now the North Carolinians who are stranded because of the hurricane, well, she needs $137 million to give relief to Lebanese who have enabled their country to be seized by an Iranian terrorist organization, Hezbollah, and for their country to be transformed into Iran's forward operating base against Israel. So they get the money. And that brings us, to sort of just to sort of, I don't know, put a cherry on top, right? So on the one hand, you have people like Chris Murphy who are accusing Israel of getting involved in the American elections by waging a war, because there's no reason for Israel to wage a war except to, undermine Kamala Harris's chances of getting elected on November 5th, because, nobody threatens us. We're the only actor here. Nobody else. It's not that we had around the clock the poor people in northern Israel. And I mean northern, not just in Kiryat Shmona and the Upper Galilee, whose communities have all been vacated and evacuated since mid-October. I'm talking about Haifa. I'm talking about Carmiel. I'm talking about communities that are very much populated still today. They had no high holiday. They had no Rosh Hashanah. They had no Shabbat, because hour after hour after hour, they kept getting called back into their secure rooms, their bomb shelters, etc. And I can tell you that, where we live in Gush Etzion, we've had very little, thank God, in terms of missile assaults in this area of the country to date since October 7th. I think we've been down in our shelter maybe a half dozen times. But the people in the north and the people in the south for years before October 7th, I mean, these are people who have to go and sit in their secure rooms, their bomb shelters for hours. And here, it's it's the holiest period in the Jewish year. We were happy. We were at synagogue in the morning, and then we visited with friends. We had them over for meals. We went over to other people's houses for meals. And we had a wonderful holiday for 2 days, and then Shabbat. These people had no holiday. We're talking about over 1 million Israelis. They had no holiday because every 15 minutes they have to go back into their bomb shelter. They can't go in the northern areas in the Golan Heights and, in Nahariya and other places. I don't know how many people felt comfortable going to synagogue. It depends how close the synagogue is to their home, because how much do you want to be exposed? You can be attacked and killed at any moment. You can't go to pray. You can't sit in your dining room and have lunch or dinner, because every 15 minutes, what are they doing? So we're sitting on the floor in their shelter, eating their holiday meals. I mean, imagine if this was Christmas in the United States, how Americans would feel if they have to do this. But according to Chris Murphy and some anonymous Senate Democratic source, he says the senior Senate Democratic aide backed Murphy's claim, noting Netanyahu has a long reputation as a meddler in American politics. I don't think for a minute that Bibi's not doing it just to impact domestic elections. I think he thinks he can get the Jewish vote to swing, but he may get the entire Arab American vote to swing. It's appalling, right? I mean, this is pure anti-Semitism. Right? It's got nothing to do with the war being waged against Israel along 7 fronts, all controlled by Iran. No, it's just because Netanyahu is a serial meddler in American politics. Give me a break, right? I mean, let's talk about the constant, continuous subversion, political subversion that the Biden administration has been carrying out against the Netanyahu government since, the election, since before it was elected, and certainly since it was elected, and throughout the past year, to undermine Netanyahu's ability to make decisions, to oust him from power, working openly with all of his political opponents, both in and out of the Knesset, in and out of the government, in order to constrain his ability to wage the war. But it's Netanyahu who refuses to be constrained by this subversion, by this political subversion, by this meddling on the part of Tony Blinken and Joe Biden and all of their, all of their underlings. Right. He's the one that's meddling in American politics. And again, it's true. 65% of Israelis against 13% of Israelis are for Trump and against Kamala or for Kamala Harris. Right. I mean, he's winning completely in Israel. Right. So it's true that Israelis prefer Trump overall to Kamala Harris and by an enormous margin, I doubt that even Alabama has such a big margin. Right. We're redder than any red state. But here you have, but there's a reason for that. And it's got nothing to do with being Democrats or being Republicans or Netanyahu being a Republican and not being a Democrat. It's simply got to do with the fact that we're fighting a war for our national survival, and the Democrats have been meddling in our internal politics to try to prevent us from winning. And here, we can go to just what Senator Cotton and Senator McConnell wrote in a letter to the president last week, where they said to him clearly, look, you have enacted an unofficial, illegal arms embargo against Israel, blocking weapon systems that the United States already approved and is now law, right? You're blocking JDAM's 2,000-pound bombs from being transferred to Israel. Right. I mean, this is, what did we used? We used JDAMs to kill Nasrallah and to kill Nasrallah's replacement. And every time, when I hear about 83 tons of explosives we used to attack Nasrallah, for instance. And so I hear this and I got to get scared because I say, well, the Americans have embargoed JDAMs. That means that, every bomb that we use for necessary military actions, because again, and these tunnels that we've found are dozens of meters underground, and it's pure rock. What are you supposed to use in order to penetrate them if not 2,000-pound bombs? I mean, you don't have other ordnance that can reach these kinds of, reinforced, incredibly dangerous underground tunnels that Hezbollah has built in Lebanon along the border with Israel. Right? What are we supposed to use? So they don't want us to use JDAMs, so they're blocking us. And I saw that there was a report in The Marker over the weekend, I think it was, or last week, that said that Elbit, the Israeli defense contractor, just got a $1.5 billion shekel contract with the defense ministry to build a factory that's going to produce JDAMs for the Air Force, which is great, but it's going to take a year or two for it to begin production. So we're talking about a plan that, I thought that it had already started. I'm actually a little bit concerned that it only was approved now. All the same, we're still going to need, a year or two to get this up and running. And in the meantime, obviously, France isn't going to give us JDAMs, and not only because they don't have them. And so here are the Americans who are embargoing JDAMs. They're also embargoing D9 Caterpillar tractors, which are needed for many things, amongst them mine removal, right? Mine detection and removal. So they're blocking Israel receiving D9 Caterpillar tractors. And so doing, they're placing the lives of IDF soldiers in danger. Why? Because D9 is like a popular thing for, Biden voting, Kamala Harris voting, progressive anarchists to point to and say, see, Israel is using this to destroy the homes of poor, guileless Palestinian terrorists. Oh, I'm sorry, no terrorists. They're all innocent civilians. Right. So we have a situation where they're embargoing absolutely necessary weapons systems, and they're also embargoing, according to Cotton and McConnell, Apache attack helicopters that they agreed to sell Israel, but now they're not willing to transfer them. Why? I don't know why, but I can tell you that one Apache helicopter is probably worth a battalion of tanks. and it's much safer to operate in a mountainous region like Lebanon, okay, like South Lebanon. So if you're dealing with ground operations in Lebanon, one of the most effective tools of war that you can use is an Apache helicopter. So the United States obviously doesn't want to send them to us so that we can place all of our tank soldiers in harm's way in a way that would be unnecessary if we had the Apaches that the U.S. Congress had already requisitioned to Israel, and Biden had agreed to send and signed the bill into law. Right. So those are the three systems. And then Senator Cotton said that there are another 10 systems that Israel has commissioned to purchase from the United States, that the United States has been upholding the orders of these 10 different systems for over 4 months. So that they signed contracts with Israel to sell Israel things, I would assume, like assault rifles and ammunition for them. And they're not transferring them. They've been paid for, they're not being transferred. They've been approved, they're not being transferred. Why? It's an unofficial arms embargo. Well, Kamala Harris met with Arab leaders in Michigan. And just remember, I don't know if you saw this, but there was a report in I think it was in the Free Beacon. I'll look it up, but I'll put it up here right now. You can see that leaders in Dearborn, Michigan, right? Oh, I'm sorry, their website, Dearborn city website, posted a post celebrating the death of 8 Israeli soldiers in Lebanon earlier this week. And, they're all opposed to killing Hassan Nasrallah. You have a very large Shiite community in Dearborn, Michigan that supports Hezbollah. And Kamala Harris met with Muslim leaders and said to them, we want to get to an immediate ceasefire in Lebanon, ceasefire in Gaza, Israel to stand down in Judea and Samaria, because she's going after their votes. And here also, I think we get to the ideology at the heart of all of this, because, yeah, it's true. I saw a political piece that said that the Democrats are really worried now that they're going to lose Michigan because of the Muslim vote. But it's not just the Muslims that are voting against the Democrats. It's also working class whites, Hispanics, men who are making up increasingly Trump's vote base in Michigan, and not only in Michigan. So if Kamala, and they're a much larger demographic than the Muslim community in Michigan, where apparently the two candidates are split evenly, which means also, why would 50% of Muslims support Donald Trump over Kamala Harris when, despite everything that they may think of Joe Biden or Kamala Harris, they're much more anti-Israel than Donald Trump is, who just called for Israel to bomb Iran's nuclear installations, right? So why would, if all that was motivating Arab voters is Israel, then why would half of them be voting for Trump? And the answer is apparently not only among Muslim Americans in Detroit, but obviously among non-Muslim Americans in Detroit, taking it to Israel is not the most important electoral issue. And so you would be meeting with those people. You would be meeting with the working class in Michigan. You would be doing things for them if you wanted to go after the vote. You wouldn't be preferring aid to Lebanon over aid to hurricane victims in North Carolina. If you were thinking rationally about how to actually win an election, and less about how to adhere to the wishes of your hardest of hard line ideological constituents, then you wouldn't be concentrating so much effort on the Muslim community in Dearborn and in Detroit. You would be thinking about a much larger demographic of United Auto Workers, Teamsters, et cetera, which the Democratic Party is ignoring on behalf of a campaign that is tailored towards the most extreme fringes of the Democratic coalition. Why would you do this unless it was ideology at the heart of your campaign? And I would argue that you wouldn't do this unless it was ideology that was driving your campaign rather than political expedience, political interests of actually getting people to vote for you. But it doesn't matter, because you have people like Chris Murphy and senior Democratic sources in the Senate who are going to say that it doesn't matter because, you're right not to support Israel because there's no reason for Israel to be having this war. And the only reason that Israel is fighting at all is in order to undermine Kamala Harris's campaign. And this brings me to the object of all of their hatred. The one person who like all of their hatred is just kind of like, directed against. And who is that? Of course, it's Prime Minister Netanyahu, right? I mean, the bogeyman in this whole thing is Bibi, 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 right? I certainly worry that Prime Minister Netanyahu is watching the American elections as he makes decisions about his military campaign in the north and in Gaza, right? And then the Senate Democratic aide, he said, I don't think for a minute that Bibi is not doing it just to impact domestic elections. I think he thinks he can get the Jewish vote to swing. So this is Bibi, right? Bibi is living rent-free in their brains, right? He's the one. He's the terrible one. He's the meddler. He's the rogue actor in all this. Not Iran, not Hezbollah, not Hamas, right? It's all about him. And here, I think it's really important just to end this with an appreciation of the Prime Minister. On Saturday night, Channel 12, their correspondent, Omi Maniv, had this investigation of the operations branch of the IDF's failed response to the invasion of October 7th. And one of the things that came out, and again, not for the first time, is that the IDF, with top brass, had all of this information about Hamas's intentions, both historical and imminent, to invade Israel on October 7th, including in late night conversations between the chief of staff and operations chief and the commander of the Southern Command. And they chose not to do anything because they didn't want to undermine intelligence sources, expose intelligence sources. Who knows? That's what they said in the investigation. But it's not just that they didn't tell the police to, close up the Nova Music Festival, to save all the lives of the over 360 young people who were murdered just for wanting to dance and raped and brutalized and kidnapped by these Hamas terrorists on October 7th. It's not just that they didn't tell the police. They didn't tell the Gaza division commander, wake up your soldiers so that they should be on guard duty at dawn. And then tell them to arm the tanks, and put them at the border. They didn't have many tanks, but they had some, and they weren't at the border, right? And they weren't armed. Nothing. They totally failed, right? But it wasn't just them that they didn't tell to do these things. It was also Prime Minister Netanyahu that they didn't tell. They didn't wake him up. They didn't tell his military attaché everything that they knew about what Hamas was doing. They had their interpretation, which was insane. They said that Hamas was only practicing because they were afraid that Israel was about to invade. And so the underlying assumption is that the reason not to actually guard at dawn on October 7th is because you don't want to make them, you don't want to do anything that would reinforce their suspicion that you're about to invade. So you don't actually even wake up your guards, right? And so you had hundreds of soldiers who were murdered in their beds, right, on October 7th, because these people are that incompetent. But Netanyahu didn't know. To the contrary, a week before the invasion, they met with the prime minister and they told the prime minister that there was no threat emanating from Gaza that was imminent, that Hamas remained deterred. So they said this to him, and then he went up north for a vacation, just as I did with my family. I saw the protesters who had come in from Tel Aviv making noise all over the place while we were trying to enjoy a vacation. They were undermining our vacation. Imagine what they did to the prime minister and his wife, who were simply trying to have a couple of days of R&R. And they, of course, never would have been there if the army had told the prime minister what they knew about Hamas's preparations, but they didn't. They hid it all from the prime minister, right? So this is the general staff. And at every point since October 7th, you've had total support of the IDF general staff for every ceasefire offer on the table. Herzi Halevi did not want to go into Lebanon. He didn't want to carry out the beepers thing. He didn't want to go against Qasem Nasrallah. And the other thing that's so astounding is that, the special forces found all of these weapons, hundreds of meters from the border, right across from Israeli communities, and yet you had the general staff and Yoav Gallant, right, calling for Israel to agree to some sort of diplomatic deal with Hezbollah that was going to leave all of these people and their arms in place, which is insane. So they're saying that the 60, 80,000 Israelis who were evacuated from their homes should have come back anyway, even though they knew what was waiting for them on the other side of the border. They were suing for a ceasefire in Lebanon and, of course, in Gaza throughout this war. And the only person who blocked that is Netanyahu. So far, what Netanyahu accomplished over the past year of October 7th, again, where the army knew about what was planned and they hid it all from him, is, first of all, he prevented Israel from losing the war. It's only because of his leadership that Israel didn't lose yet, right? That's it. Because had it been up to Chief of Staff of the IDF, Herzl Levy, and his generals, or Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, we would have sought a ceasefire without victory. We would have accepted one without victory, which would have left Hamas in charge of Gaza and would have left Hezbollah at the border with its weapons, with Nasrallah and all of the officers who have been taken out, right? In charge, intact, with all of their body parts. Capable, willing, and able, and poised to invade Israel. So he is the reason that we didn't capitulate. He's the only reason, I would argue, he and the Israeli public that refused to capitulate. He and our soldiers who have been fighting like lions for an entire year. I'll just say something else. We have this heroism forum. And they put up they have a big tent across from the Prime Minister's office, and Prime Minister Netanyahu went in and out of nowhere, and he visited them last week. And I was walking my dogs over the weekend and over the holiday and one of the afternoons, and when you pass by, when you drive by all the time, their banners, and they have all the pictures of of many of the soldiers who were killed, and then a demand to fight to victory on the top. And as I was walking there past it, I thought, hey, you're not in your car. You can stop. Why don't you look at the pictures? Why don't you look at the people? Why don't you look at these soldiers? And it just breaks your heart. Girls, boys. I mean, these are Israel's best of the best. And they're all dead. And they all gave their lives fighting this war to date. Hundreds and hundreds of them. And I looked at all of them, and I took some time, and I looked at every single one of their pictures. And I started crying, and that makes sense. But just think about it. All of them, along with the 800 civilians who have been killed, they were all alive a year ago. They were all alive on October 6th. They were all young and good looking and had their whole future ahead of them, their whole lives ahead of them. And they're all dead now, fighting this war. And the only person who said you did not die in vain, who said, we're fighting to victory. Your sacrifice is going to lead us to an historic victory, to a rebirth of our national mandate, or whatever you want to call it, to our national life. We're going to remove these strategic threats from our borders in Gaza and in Lebanon and in Iran. Is Netanyahu. And then we get him, we get a Senate source saying, I don't think for a minute that Bibi's not doing it just to impact domestic elections. How obscene, how horrible, how stupid, how anti-Semitic can you be? I mean, really? So you look at what we've sacrificed. You look at the heroism of our soldiers and of the parents of our society, of the mayors of these cities that are under attack. I've heard the mayor of Carmiel was just bashed over the weekend. I mean, his town was, and of all of these communities along in the north, all saying to Netanyahu, we'll take it. You just keep going. Don't stop. We want to win. We don't want life to go back to normal until this threat to our very existence has been taken out. That takes courage. We have a very courageous people here in Israel. And thank God we have a very courageous leader at the helm. And then we have a bunch of cowards who cower before the Americans, who cower before the UN, before Macron. They're, let's capitulate. Winning, that's a lie. It's a fantasy. You can't win. Yes, you can, and we are. But we wouldn't have gotten to the point where we feel like we're on the path where, yes, we've seized the initiative in Lebanon and in Gaza, and you have people crying uncle in both places, saying, "Let's give up. Let's let the hostages out. Let's Hezbollah is destroying Lebanon." You're getting these voices. You're not getting them in Israel, except for the same people who've been rioting against the government since November 2022 when it was elected. So, look at these voices, listen to them, and what do they say? And in Israel, a year into the war, the public will to win is stronger than ever. Our military is better than ever. I mean, if you compare where we were as a military force on October 6th to where we are on October 6, 2024, in terms of our soldiers, they're now veterans of Gaza when they go into Lebanon. And yes, it's true, we're facing a horrible sacrifice there as well. And nobody takes it lightly. Nobody. But we're stronger than we were a year ago. We're more united than we were a year ago. And yes, overwhelmingly, we want a president in the United States in power who's going to support our will to win and our imperative victory. Yeah. And that's not a conspiracy. That's a national interest. It would be great if we got that on both sides, if it was a bipartisan position in the United States. But it doesn't feel like it is anymore. And that's the problem that we face in Israel vis-a-vis the United States. And in the meantime, we have until November 5th. And every day is a day. Every day is a day that's not going to be restored. And we have to make the most of every single one of them, despite everything, despite Chris Murphy, and despite all of these anonymous sources. And these U.S. publications like The Hill that are willing to print conspiracy theories as news, right? We have to be willing to go forward. And thank God, right? At this time in our history as a people, we have an incredibly courageous people. We have an incredibly courageous prime minister. So those are my thoughts going into October 7th tomorrow. And I'll see you again later this week. We have a special from Faraz that we shot last week that we're going to be releasing as well for the anniversary. So take care, and we'll see you again very soon.